The Commander. He loved me tenderly and shyly from a distance, and later on took a naive pride in seeing my name in print. I heard the news today, oh boy, the English army had just won the war. An ancient piece of Judaic commentary holds that the liver is the organ that best represents the relationship between parents and child. It is the heaviest of all the viscera, and accordingly the most appropriate bit of one's guts. Only 2 of the 613 Jewish commandments, or prohibitions, offer any reward for compliance, and both are parental. The first is in the original Decalogue, when those who honor thy father and thy mother are assured that this will increase their days in the promised or stolen Canaanite land that is about to be given them. And the second involves some convoluted piece of quasi-reasoning whereby a bird's egg can be taken by a hungry Jew as long as the poor mother bird isn't there to witness the depredation. How to discern whether it's a mother or father bird is not confided by the sages. Commander Eric Ernst Hitchens of the Royal Navy, my middle name is Eric, and I have sometimes idly wondered how things might have been different if either of us had been called Ernest, was a man of relatively few words, would have had little patience for Talmudic convolutions, and was not one of those whom nature had designed to be a nest builder. But his liver, to borrow a phrase from Gore Vidal, was that of a hero. And I must have inherited from him my fondness, if not my tolerance, for strong waters. I can remember perhaps 3 or 4 things of the rather laconic and different sort that he had said to me. One, also biblically derived, was that my early socialist conviction was founded on sand. Another was that while one ought to beware of women with thin lips, this was the nearest we ever approached to a male-on-male conversation. Those with widely spaced eyes were to be sought out and appreciated. Excellent advice both times and no doubt dearly bought. Out of nowhere in particular, but on some unusually bleak west country day, he pronounced, I sometimes think that the Gulf Stream is beginning to weaken, thereby anticipating either the warming or else the cooling that seemingly awaits us all. When my firstborn child, his first grandson, arrived, I got a one-lined card. Glad it's a boy. Perhaps you are by now getting an impression. But the remark that most summed him up was the flat statement that the war of 1939 to 1945 had been the only time when I really felt I knew what I was doing. This, as I was made to appreciate while growing up myself, had actually been the testament of a British generation. Born in the early years of the century, afflicted by slump and depression after the First World War in which their fathers had fought, then flung back into combat against German imperialism in their maturity, starting to get married and to have children in the bleak austerity that succeeded victory in 1945. They all wondered quite where the years of their youth and strength had gone, and saw only more decades of struggle and hardship still to come before the exigencies of retirement. As Bertie Wooster once phrased it, they experienced some difficulty in detecting the bluebird. It could have been worse. My father's father, the stern Alfred Ernest Hitchens, was a mirthless Calvinist patriarch who took a dim view of everything from music to television. The old man's forebears hailed from the backlands of Thomas Hardy's Wessex, and perhaps even further west. Hitchens being in its origin a Cornish name, and my brother possesses ancestral birth and marriage certificates that are signed with an X by the peasants who were most probably recruited into Portsmouth to help build the historic dockyards. Portsmouth, the true home port of the Royal Navy, and nicknamed Pompeii, as is its soccer team, by those locals for whom no other town will do. It is one of the world's most astonishing natural harbors, rivaling even Valletta in the way that it commands the channel, approaches to the Atlantic and the North Sea, and it looms over the French coast while sheltering in the lee of the Isle of Wight, which the conquering Romans once named Vectis. the last place that Horatio Nelson set foot on dry land, and to this moment the home of his flagship, the Victory, the birthplace of Charles Dickens, and the home of Rudyard Kipling and Arthur Conan Doyle. Here I drew my first squalling breath on 13th of April, 1949, and here my male ancestors embarked time again to slip down the channel to do the king's enemies a bit of no good. My grandfather had been a ranker in the army in India, and was to the end of his days only softened in his general Puritan harshness by his warm affection for that country, expressed in a collection of Benares brasses that competed for space in his home with the biographies of forgotten missionaries. I still have an oil painting, almost my only family heirloom, which depicts a blue-eyed, rosy-cheeked 10-year-old boy in a white collar and a blue bow-tied suit. This promising lad is looking into the distance and arguably being instructed to think of his country's destiny. In my own youth, I was made to stand next to this frame, while older relatives remarked on the distinct resemblance I bore to great-uncle Harry. The boy in the frame was indeed my great-uncle, acting as the model for an exhibition called Young England in 1900. 15 years later, his cruiser was shattered and sunk in the Battle of Jutland. There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today, as Admiral Beatty commented, on seeing yet another vessel burst its boilers and go sky high. Yet he survived in the bitter North Sea waters and is said to have saved the shivering Maltese mess steward while quietly letting the barbels sink unpaid to the bottom. I don't quite remember how old I was before I met anybody who wasn't concerned with the Navy, or at least with some branch of the armed forces, of which ours was always the senior service. I was christened on a submarine, urinating freely as the Reverend made me the first Hitchens to eschew baptism in Judaism and become a member of the more middle-class Church of England. I came to understand the difference between a destroyer and a cruiser and a corvette, and could tell someone's rank by the number of gold rings worn on the sleeve. When we moved to Malta, it was for the Navy. When we migrated to Scotland, it was to the base at Rosyth, quite near the Dunfermline, birthplace of Admiral Cochrane, liberator of Chile, and model for Patrick O'Brien's Jack Aubrey. When we were transferred again to Plymouth, I went to a boys' boarding school in the Devonshire town of Tavistock, birthplace of Sir Francis Drake. Every dormitory at the school was named for an admiral who had vanquished England's and later Great Britain's enemies at sea. I have mentioned the disagreement between my mother and father as to whether they could afford that school, and I think I should now give another instance of the ways in which they did not think alike. We were living at Dartmoor Village of Crapstone, a name for which I didn't much care because it could get me roughed up at school. Where did you say you lived, Hitchens? In due time we moved away, but to a village in Sussex called Funtington, which somehow was still not quite the improvement for which I had been quietly hoping. At all events, at the age of about 9, I was listening to a bit of gossip about one of our next-door neighbors, a marine officer of lugubrious aspect and mien, and his all-enduring wife. Daphne was telling me, said my mother to my father about this man, that his temper is so foul that she's taken to diluting his gin bottle with water when he's not looking. There was a significant pause. If the woman is watering Nigel's bloody gin, said the commander, then I'm not surprised that he's always in a filthy temper. From this exchange I learned quite a lot about the different manner in which men and women, or at any rate married couples, can reason. I also added to my store of knowledge about the commander's attitude to gin, which was a relatively devout one. Alcohol for me has been an aspect of my optimism. The mood caught by Charles Ryder in Brideshead Revisited, when he discourses on the aspects of Bacchic and the Dionysian, and claims that he at least chooses to drink in the love of the moment and the wish to prolong and enhance it. I dare say some people have seen me the worse for wear in less charming ways. But I know I have been true to the original as well. The commander was not a happy drinker. He didn't actually drink all that much, but he was not a happy drinker. But he imbibed regularly and determinedly. and it was a reinforcement to his pessimism and disappointment, both personal and political. As I was beginning to say, my entire boyhood was overshadowed by two great subjects, one of them majestic, and the other rather less so. The first was the recent and terrible costly victory of Britain over the forces of Nazism. The second was the ongoing and consequent evacuation by British forces of bases and colonies that we could no longer afford to maintain. This epoch and its closure were inscribed in the very scenery around me. Portsmouth and Plymouth had both been savagely blitzed, and the scars were still palpable. The term bomb site was a familiar one, used to describe a blackened gap in a street or empty place where an office or pub used to stand. More than this, though, the drama was inscribed in the circumambient culture. Until I was about 13, I thought that all films and television programs were about the Second World War, with a strong emphasis on the role played in that war by the Royal Navy. I saw Jack Hawkins with his binoculars on the icy bridge in the cruel sea, the movie version of a heart-stopping novel about the Battle of the Atlantic by Nicholas Monsarrat, that by then I knew almost by heart. The commander, who had seen action on his ship, HMS Jamaica, in almost every maritime theater from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, had had an especially arduous and bitter time, escorting convoys to Russia over the hump of Scandinavia and Murmansk and Archangel at a time when the Nazis controlled much of the coast and the air. And on the day after Christmas, 1943, Boxing Day as the English call it, proudly participating as the Jamaica pressed home for the kill and fired torpedoes through the hull of one of Hitler's most dangerous warships, the Scharnhorst. Sending a Nazi convoy raider to the bottom is a better day's work than any I have ever done, and every year on the anniversary, the commander would allow himself one extra tot of Christmas cheer, or possibly two, which nobody begrudged him. To this day I observe the occasional myself.